party for one of my younger grandsons, Silas. His birthday was last Monday. He was at our house and spent some time with us. But I was thinking this week about that event when he was born. And I remember that. I mean, sure you do. Remember not only your children being born, but if you have grandchildren and you were around at all at the time, you remember those days. You remember that time. And I remember with Silas, Silas was very small. He's like not even 5 pounds completely. And that's because he was 4 weeks earlier. You know, we all knew that. He's 4 weeks early, 4 weeks less than the delivery time. Now, that's what we all thought, but I'm pretty sure that his mom didn't feel like he was 4 weeks early, right? Because every day that you're waiting when you're a pregnant mother is just one of those things you're glad, but you really want this to get over. You know, you really want it to end. And if you're a mom, you know it's a long, long wait. And it's much longer than it seems like it's going to be when the doctor tells you what your due date is. I mean, I have talked to a lot of moms who are in the middle of this pregnancy thing, and never, ever do they say anything to me like, boy, I sure like putting on all of this extra weight, you know. I really enjoy all those emotions going through my body, you know. I like feeling uncomfortable. I really, really like the morning sickness. Nobody ever thinks that as a mom, but the wait for them is worthwhile because it comes with a promise. The promise of a baby, the promise of their baby. And that's what I want to talk about today, this promise that God has for us. Not of a baby, but of some great things in our life, some healing in our life. And the title of the message is called Waiting Forward, which I've defined as this place where perseverance meets hope, where we put everything out there, trusting in God, waiting for Him, hoping for Him. But we know, we believe with our whole being that at the end of this waiting period, that there is an answer, that there is a reward, that our hope will be met with something. And we endure the hurting because we know in our hearts that God will come through. And when we persevere in the struggle, we hope by faith and believe by trust that He will come through, that He will deliver. And so we wait. We wait through our health struggles, not knowing what this world is going to tell us, not knowing what the doctor or the tests or the procedures are going to lead us to. But we wait because we believe on the other side of our wait, God has an answer. And we wait through the relationship issues that we have, where we wonder whether our marriage is going to survive. We wonder whether we're going to be able to relate to our children or to our parents. Or we wonder if we're going to be able to restore a friendship that seems to be on the rocks at this point. But we wait because we have this hope in what God can and has done for us in our lives. We wait through the times of poverty in our lives. Physical poverty, emotional poverty, and certainly our financial poverty, when we wonder how in the world we can make it through the month with the money that we have because it doesn't seem to come through on paper. And we just trust, we just believe, we just wait forward that God will come through for us. We wait through the issues of our damaged emotions and pains and problems and struggles that we have from decisions that we made in earlier years of our life, or that the damage that someone has caused for us. But we wait believing that God will come through with the answer to His promise. And life is hard, but we still expect, we still believe, we still trust that God can do something great. And sometimes in life, that's what is required of us, that we wait forward. So we've been going through the last 5 weeks, I think it is, this book of Mark. We've been talking about the book of Mark, and today we're going to be in Mark as well. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5. We're going to look at a couple stories that are kind of intertwined together. They interact with each other. Let me set the scene for you here. We are in the book of Mark. Mark, as you probably know or remember from our teachings here, is written by a guy by the name of Mark, right? Or John Mark, if you look in the New Testament, the book of Acts and stuff. And John Mark was a spiritual disciple, a son, so to speak, of Peter. He traveled with Peter. He was with Peter. So Mark writes this book, which most scholars believe is really a telling of Peter's story, because Mark tends to be this mouthpiece of Peter. He speaks almost as if it were Peter speaking. And he writes, most scholars believe, he writes to the church in Rome, where Peter served for a couple of decades. And he writes at a time period in AD 65-ish that this city of Rome, this church in Rome, was struggling in some super unimaginable ways with an emperor called Nero, who was dead set on destroying all of the Christians and all the churches in that area. We were able to visit Rome a few years ago, and when we were there, we walked through these immense, marvelous churches, a couple dozen of these churches, almost too many, and everyone we walked into was like incredible and amazing, and they were everywhere in the city. But in the day when Mark is writing to this church, there's only one church in Rome. And it's not some great edifice somewhere that people can come into and listen to organ music and hear choirs and have people in robes speaking to them. It's an underground church. It's a hidden church. It's a church that's trying to survive, trying to figure out if they're going to be able to survive. There was no history of Christianity at that point. There was no Bible for the people other than the words of the Old Testament. And so these young Christians who are struggling with this day-to-day life, being separated from their jobs, separated from their families, and wondering if this God they'd heard about is as real as they've been told. And Mark comes along with these beautiful, wonderful words. And as Mark is writing this, one of the things he speaks to is not the eloquence, not the beauty, not the marvelousness or the majesty of Jesus in the way that, say, Matthew does, or even Luke, or even John. It's not about the relationships for the most part. When Mark speaks, it's about the power. He knows Rome is a city of power. It is the world city of power. And he's speaking to people in a seemingly powerless situation about the power that they have in Jesus Christ. He talks about the miracles. He talks about the healings. He talks about the way Jesus teaches power in people's lives and speaks power into their life. He talks about the way the crowds follow this man of power, how they love this man of power. And he talks about the existing fortresses of power, the religious leaders of that day, how they are against Jesus, how they, in the end, will crucify and kill Jesus. So last week, when we were talking, we kind of walked through chapters 3 and 4. We mostly landed at the beginning of chapter 4, and we talked a bit about this storm that takes place in their lives. And it's out on this lake, and Jesus calms the storm. And this is the first time that his followers, his disciples, had seen him exhibit some kind of a power over the forces of nature. They'd seen him touch people, they'd seen him touch things locally, but to demonstrate this kind of power over the weather systems and the wind and the waves was just unreal. And it's said that the word tells us that the disciples, upon seeing this, were more afraid of that power than they were of the power of the storm itself. So today, though, we're going to actually gravitate straight out of that. And I wanted to kind of show you on a map here. I put a map together. And so you can see this body of water is the Sea of Galilee. We talked about that quite a bit last week. You can listen back on that. But it's a large, large, large lake, like 13 miles long, 8 miles wide. And at the beginning of last week, we started up in Capernaum. That's where Jesus often gravitates to. That's his home base. It's roughly the area where Peter and his family lives. It's where Matthew is from. It's where James and John are from. It's where they fish out of that port. And they leave that and they head across the other side. They call it the other side. Wish we had time to talk about what the other side all is about. But they head across to the other side to what they call the Gerasenes. Now, on the Gerasene side, first off, that's not a Jewish side. That's a Greek side and a Roman side. It's very non-religious in the sense of the Bible. But they head across there, and you'll remember that it was right in the middle of that lake that there's this storm that takes place. That's from last week. So Jesus, after he calms the water, he heads to the other side. And there's an episode there, which we don't have time to talk about today, but you probably heard about it, where Jesus shows up, and there's this man who lives in the tombs. He's got this evil spirit in him. Nobody can hold him down. He breaks chains, and he's just one of those guys that lives out there because he's got this horrible evil spirit in him. He comes up to Jesus, and Jesus casts the spirit from him into these pigs. It's like 2,000 pigs, and then he sends the pig over the cliff. And the people in that area, they know this. They can't believe that Jesus could change this man's life so that the spirit can come out of him and he can be a normal person again. And they can't believe that this spirit would go into 2,000 pigs and that they would go over the side of the cliff. So they're very afraid as well of this power that Jesus has. And they beg him, please leave. Now, there's another story. I don't know if we'll get back to it in this series or not, on when Jesus returns later and the influence that that event has on the people at a later event. But their initial response is fear. So they send him back, and he travels back across to the other side, back to Capernaum, where he came from, and all he wants to do is teach. And so we're going to talk about these two stories, and in these two stories, there are three characters that we're going to introduce to you. The first one, of course, is Jesus. Remember, it's all about him. Everything we read, everything we study, everything we talk about, it's all about him. That's the way our lives need to be, all about him. But there's two other characters. One of them is a man by the name of Jairus. And Jairus, as we'll learn in just a minute, is a leader in the synagogue. He is a Jewish leader in the local synagogue, which Jesus had spent much time in. And he knew Jesus, and Jesus knew him as well. And then there's this woman, and she's got her own problem. It's a physical problem. It's a very personal problem. But these two stories, these two lives interact because both of them are waiting. Both of them are hoping. So Matthew 5, verse 21, here's what we read. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, so he went to the other side, and then he came back to, from that point perspective, the other side again. He's back on where he started. When he crossed over by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Again, we said this every week. This is the theme of Jesus' life. Everywhere he goes, large crowds come. He can't go into town because large crowds swamp him. He can't go into homes to eat because the large crowds press against him. Everywhere he is, they're just constantly. And you can imagine like some famous rock star or some famous actor or some famous athlete. But more likely the rock star, because it seems like with the rock stars, the fans they're just clamoring, they're crowding around, they're just pushing in. And that's where Jesus, in fact, sometimes he tells the disciples, get a boat. I want to go out in the boat because they can't push against me when I'm teaching from the boat. But if I'm at the edge of the water, they'll just push me right into the water because they're really just concerned about getting to me and being near me. They want to be healed. They want to be touched. So there he is. He says, then one of the synagogue leaders, Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, and he pleaded earnestly with him. This is probably not a normal stance for this leader. He says, my little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jairus is the leader of the local synagogue there. He is the manager. He's not the preacher. He's not the teacher. He's just the manager. He's the manager of the facility. He makes sure it's clean, that everything's in order, that people do what they're supposed to. He's the manager of probably the teaching school that's out of that place. So he's maybe like a principal in the school of sorts for people to bring their children to so they can be trained. He is the sort of the worship leader. Not that he teaches people or does the worship part, but he controls it. He watches over it. And so you can imagine he's probably the guy that's in charge of the worship service when Jesus was there and the man who was possessed by a spirit came way back, I think, in chapter 1 when we were talking, one of our first weeks. And he saw this whole interruption to a service, probably not very happy with this. He didn't know Jesus at that time. But now, after seeing what Jesus can do, now at this point of great need in his life, he's come back to Jesus. And the other thing about him is that he's a powerful man. He is a wealthy man. He is an influential man, and he is a religious leader. So you can bet that he's very close with those people we've called the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law. And so it's not normal for him to interact with Jesus. Jesus is the other group of people. Jesus is who he's working against. He would be on Jesus' camp of enemies. But something has happened in his life. His daughter is not well. In fact, she is so sick that he is in mortal fear that she will die. And there's nothing worse for a parent than to lose a child. Nothing can compare. We, thankfully, have never lost one, but we've had some close calls. Many years ago, some of you in this church were here when we remember when our oldest son, Joshua, when he accidentally took too much of a certain kind of medication. And we spent 4 days with him in the hospital as he's in a coma, an induced coma, not knowing whether he was going to live, not knowing even if he lived how his brain, how his life would be changed. And we praise the Lord continuously that he restored him. Some of you were here the day maybe when I was preaching at the end of that week and I was sharing this story, and as kind of just the sign of God's goodness and grace in our lives, Joshua coming in through the side door, and you got a chance to see him and speak to him. Praise God for that. That is just an incredible thing. Some of you remember when our third son, Andy, was in the military and was shipped off to Iraq during the middle of a war. And we didn't know sometimes what was going on in those situations. And we would talk to him as often as we could, but he would tell us about this person or that group or something where people on his base had been killed, and the kind of fear that he lived in, knowing that there were others in his area that were hoping and working towards some sort of a plan to kill him. That's fearful for a parent. We understand that as parents, when your child runs out into the street and the first thing you do is look for cars and your heart just drops out. You know, when your child's very sick and they're not breathing and you're carrying them out into the open cold air to try and get some oxygen to go through them, or you're waiting in some emergency. When the doctor tells you that there's something wrong with your child and you don't know, and some of you have lived on the other side of that, and you know what it's like to endure a child who's either died or has come very, very close to it. There is nothing worse for a parent, nothing. After all the months of waiting for this child to be born and all the promises from that child, and then to go through year after year after that. I have a pastor friend whose daughter was diagnosed with something at an early age, before she was even a teenager. And they hoped and they prayed and they worked with her, knowing from what the world said that this daughter would die. And yet they trusted God he would carry him through whatever happened. And when the daughter was about 18 years old, she did die. And I've grieved with that mom who years later is still struggling with that, still trusting the Lord, still waiting for his promises to be fulfilled. This is where Jairus was, not knowing whether his daughter's going to live, not caring who helped him, willing to do almost anything for the life of his daughter. Right now, for him, it was all about Jesus. He had seen Jesus work. He had heard of Jesus. He hadn't raised anybody from the dead yet, but he had calmed storms. He'd cast demons out. And so Jairus has come to Jesus for hope. Mark says this in verse 24. So Jesus went with him. And of course, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. So the crowd's there. They're waiting too, right? They want to see another miracle. They want to see something that Jesus does. It's amazing. They want to go and talk about how incredible this guy is. They just want to watch us. They're watchers. They're waiting for this miracle. And Jairus, he's waiting too, but he's waiting for hope to be fulfilled. He's waiting for his daughter to be healed. He's waiting for his daughter to be saved. And they're on the way. He's talked to Jesus, and Jesus has agreed to come with him to the house. But then there's a plot twist. Verse 25. And a woman was there in the crowd who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. You're later going to see that this daughter of Jairus was also 12 years old. So the entire time that this girl of Jairus has been living and working and playing and getting sick, the entire time this woman has been bleeding. She had suffered a great deal, it says, under the care of many doctors, and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, that hope, that possibility, that promise, she came up behind him in the crowd and she touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. I mean, that's incredible kind of faith. That if I could just touch him, not even ask him to do anything, just brush against him. Have you ever noticed that Jesus' ministry often comes through interruptions? I mean, it's always something going on. He's teaching in the synagogue, and a man with a spirit in him comes in, and Jesus has to heal him. He goes home that day after church for lunch. He's just going to relax, kick back. No, he can't because Peter's mother-in-law's there, and she's sick. He's praying one time, spending time with the Lord, refueling himself, and here comes Peter. Hey, they're looking for you. Everybody's wanting to get to you. He gets back to Peter's home later, and he's teaching in the home. He's in the middle of touching people, and whoa, what's that? Somebody's cutting through the roof and lowering down a person who needs to be healed, not just in his body, but in his spirit. He's at a barbecue at Matthew's home, and he's trying to witness. He's trying to share the faith, and there's the leaders. They're coming in, and they're talking about him and interrupting the whole event. He's in the synagogue again, and this time a man comes in, and his hand is all shriveled up. And in the middle of that, he finds out that these religious leaders, they're testing him on this. They have a plan to undermine everything he does. And in the middle of that, he's called to restore that hand. He's trying to eat with his disciples, but as they said, the crowd is pressing in. And on top of that, his family comes. Oh, we got to take him home. He's out of his mind. He doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, to have all that facing you. In the last week, we looked at this. He's out on the boat, relaxing, not teaching, not healing, just taking a little nap down below. And the storm comes, and the disciples have to wake him, have to see what he can do to save them in this here. Now here's Jesus. He's just returned from this event on the other side where he's cast out this demon from this man, and he's teaching, and here comes Jairus. Jairus got a need. Jesus, come, I need you now. Another interruption, and it's urgent. And then in the middle of that interruption, this woman comes with her own interruption. Have you ever wondered, have you ever thought that maybe your life is interrupting Jesus? But if you ever think that, have you ever wondered if maybe that's what Jesus wants? That he lives for the interruption? That his ministry is a ministry of interruption? And maybe sometimes we forget that the interruptions in our lives are what we're built for, that Jesus wants us to be like him in that way. Let's talk about this woman. It says she was subject to bleeding for 12 years. Okay, listen. This is not bleeding from her hand, right? She is menstruating. We do not need to go into great deal. But could we agree on this? It's not comfortable. It's not pleasant. Not for a few days, not for a month. Listen, this lady has been in menstruation for 12 years. And this issue has caused her two great problems. First, it tells us that she's broke now, because it says she suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. So everything she had, she's put into this. She wants to be free from this. She's willing to give everything, and she's done that. But these quacks have made her worse. They've given her whatever advice, whatever direction that they've given her, and she's now worse than she was. But on top of that, she's also broke. I mean, do you get the hopelessness of her situation? Some of you have been to a doctor, and a doctor's told you good things, and you've followed those things, and you've done well. But some of you have been to a doctor who suggested a course of action, maybe a surgery, maybe something else. And when you're done with that, in your own head, you thought, I'm actually worse than I was before I went to the doctor. And you're still paying the bill for the doctor. 12 years this woman has dealt with this, and all of her money has gone. Now, it's true, you can't buy happiness with money. But I'm going to tell you this. If you don't have enough money for what you need in life, it is a guarantee of unhappiness. There are certain things in life that we do require, certain things we do need. Food, for example, warmth, safety, security, those kinds of things. And if we don't have that kind of money, if we have no money at all and we're broke, it's not a very secure or satisfying life. So this woman, one of her problems is she's broke. But the second problem is this: she is broken. Let me tell you, the Mosaic law was a problem for her, because the Mosaic law said when a woman is in that situation that she is unclean, not sinful. Don't ever underestimate what God's saying there. He's not saying she's sinful. It's the issue is blood. Blood is a sacred thing to God. It's by his blood that we are saved, right? So when a woman was dealing with this issue of blood, they were considered unclean, and there was a process and a time for that woman to become clean. But while she's unclean, she can't touch anyone, and they can't touch her for 12 years, kind of like a leper. She can't touch her husband. He can't touch her. She can't touch her children. They can't touch her. She can't touch her friend. They can't touch her. And if she does, if she's even around them, she has to yell out just so everybody knows, unclean, so that nobody will accidentally touch her and make themselves unclean as all. Now listen, that's not how God saw her. He did not see her as unclean, but that is how her world saw her. That is how she saw herself. And I wonder maybe if sometimes that's how we see ourselves. That maybe because of something we did, something we said, something we didn't do, that we see ourselves as unclean, and we believe that God sees us as unclean. And I have no problem in my mind believing that she thought that God saw her as unclean. So she's broken. And yet, she still hadn't given up. She's still got hope. There's still a possibility for the promise to be answered. She is still waiting forward. She is still persevering in her struggle, but hoping that God will come through for her and that he will deliver. And like everyone else, she saw Jesus as the answer to her problems. She saw his power as what she needed, if she could only touch him. But by touching him, she knew that he would then be unclean. And that concerned her. She didn't want to ask him to make himself unclean. She didn't want to be denied that he might do that. So she decides to touch him quietly, secretly. He might not even notice. It's a little risky, right? No one's even going to know, right? But this is Jesus. So Mark says in verse 29, immediately. Now I don't want to end that word. Immediately. In the book of Mark, that word is used over 40 times. Immediately means power. There's not very many times things happen in our life immediately. If you're sick and you go to the doctor and they put you on an antibiotic or some kind of medicine, I guarantee you, you do not immediately feel well. Hopefully by the next morning or the next day or a couple of days later, you're starting to feel better. But nothing happens immediately on those levels. But this says here, immediately, in this term that Mark is using to focus on the power and the action, immediately her bleeding stopped. And she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Immediately, power came. Just like the storm when Jesus is out there and it comes on, he says, be quiet, be still. Immediately, the storm ceased. Not a calming over the next hour, but an immediate action. And now watch this. Immediately, there's that word again, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. That there's this transfer of divine power from Jesus to this woman through the touching of her on his cloak. I don't know if you're old enough to remember, not all of you, but some of you maybe, back in May of 1980 when Mount St. Helens blew. We lived in Salem at the time. My wife lived in Portland. I think she was actually up in Canada at the time. So we were all around that area. Mount St. Helens blew. Listen, it is the single biggest volcanic action that's ever occurred in the United States that we know of at all. I don't know if you know what a megaton is. A megaton is 1,000,000 tons. So 1,000,000 tons of TNT is a megaton of TNT. And we are told that this explosion of Mount St. Helens was 26 megatons. If you've studied history and seen what happened in World War II when we bombed the city and laid flat the city of Hiroshima in an effort to end a war that was just killing innumerable people, this event was 1,600 times as powerful as that series of bombs across Hiroshima. It sent ash 12 miles into the sky. If you've ever flown on a commercial airline, at their top they might reach 6 miles. This is twice as high as these airplanes ever go. Literally, ash went all around the world. If you were in the Oregon area, if you were in Portland, even in Salem, you could see coming down like light snow. It'd be on cars everywhere. People would tell you, don't scratch your car, don't rub your car, because the ash, it was everywhere. This ash was built into everything. 230 square miles of destruction across the forest. In fact, the number of trees that were lost in that single instant event was 300,000 two-bedroom homes. That's the number of wood. 300,000 two-bedroom homes could have been built from the wood that was lost on that. Some of those trees just instantly just vaporized. You know, they tell you in math you can't divide by zero. Ask a volcano, because at some point it's just gone. There's just nothing left. All of that's there. And the rubble that came down from the rivers and from the ice and from the rock and from the dirt and the ash and the lava and all that, the rubble created basically a long riverbed, 17 miles long, 150 feet high. I mean, whole houses, whole areas were just totally covered by this. Bridges stuck down. Now listen, that is power. That's the kind of power that we're talking about that Jesus has with this. The Greek word for power in this verse here is the word dynamis. Now, if you look at that word, you can kind of see the word dynamis looks a little bit like dynamis, right? It's the word from which we get our American word, our English word, dynamite. It is a word of power. So Mark said that Jesus felt his dynamis go out from him. So here's this woman. She's desperate. She has to be healed. She can't go any longer. For 12 years she's endured. This is her last chance. What is she going to do? She touches Jesus, and in that moment, instantly, immediately, whoom, power from Jesus to her. No more bleeding. And she knows in her heart. She knows, not thinks, not feels. She knows that she is healed. And Mark says that Jesus knew that this power had been transferred to this woman. He also felt it. Not like he lost power, but he could feel this transaction that's going on. And it says in verse 30, he turned around in the crowd and he asked, who touched my clothes? See, nobody else around besides him and this woman had any clue. It wasn't like the wind blew everybody back or something like that. It's just this silent transfer of power that happens. But he knew, and she knew. And so the disciples, because they have no clue, they're like, hey, you see the people crowding around you, and yet you can ask, who touched me? Jesus, the crowds are all pressing in on you. They're all touching you. I mean, a better question is, who hasn't touched you here? Because it seems like everybody's touched you. The truth is Jesus already knew, even when he asked that question, who it was who touched him. He knew when she touched him. He knew how she touched him. He knew why she touched him. And he knew all that stuff. And so why did he ask this question? And the question, as we're going to see in a minute, is answered in a way that he wants her to understand that God had not forgotten her, that God valued her, that God knew her, and he saw her, and he loved her. See, here's the thing, the point I think that's important for us. No one is insignificant in Jesus' eyes. There is no one who is insignificant in his eyes. No one is unimportant. No one is unworthy. No one is without value. No one is hopeless. No one is unloved. No one is alone. No one. No matter what we've done in our lives, no matter what we've experienced, no matter what heritage we come from or our history is, we are not unloved. Not this religious leader, not this woman, not me, not you, no one. We are all valued. We are all significant in the eyes of the Lord. No matter how unclean or how unworthy or how unloved we may feel, we are not insignificant. That's what he wants this woman to know. So watch what happens here. Mark 5, verse 32. It says, Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. He knows it's her, but he doesn't want to call her out. There's a purpose. He's kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, she's been healed. What's she got to fear? Just the man whose power she has just borrowed. Trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And I'm going to guess that at that moment, she thought she was going to get a rabbi rebuke, right? She had touched him without his permission. She had potentially made him unclean, at least risked making him unclean. And now she does this. But listen, here's what Jesus says. He said to her, daughter. When's the last time you think that maybe some religious leader in her area ever said to her, daughter? Maybe like, never? How much more intimate could he be? I accept you. I want you. I was thinking about this week as I was putting things together. Friday was Valentine's Day. This is like the original Valentine. Jesus says, be mine. You are my daughter. I'm your father. There's a union between us. And he tells her, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Not just the bleeding, but all the emotional suffering through all those years. What she had lost, some things that could never be gained back. He says, go and be freed from that. Jesus says, your faith has healed you. Now I want to clarify here. When he says your faith, he's not talking about some entity that she has acquired. He's not talking about the noun of her faith, like it's something like if you can just have enough faith, if you can just acquire enough faith. Remember, Jesus said, no, it's not about how much faith you have. You can have faith as small as the grain of a mustard seed. No, it's not how much. No, it's about what you have faith in. It's not a noun, it's a verb. Do you have faith in the right? Not faith that something's going to happen, not faith for something, but faith in something, believing and trusting that God will come through. So he says to her, thanks for waiting forward. Thanks for trusting. Thanks for believing. Thanks for hoping in me. Thanks for putting your trust in me, because hoping in faith with God will deliver. She'd been living in the midst of this mob of life. And here she is now in the middle of another mob of life. It's messy. It's hard. It's rough. But what she needed was the miracle of God. And here's what I want to say. When we're stuck between the miracle and the mob, that's when we need to wait forward. We're waiting for the miracle, but right now we're just stuck in the middle of the mob. And that's where she was, and Jesus knew that. He saw that. Now listen. That's all great for her. Good news. Problem solved. Bleeding done. Jesus says go. No problems. Everybody's like, wow, that's amazing. What about Jairus? Jairus had come to Jesus. In fact, Jairus came first. Jairus is there first. And this woman, as they're on the way to Jairus' house for an urgent situation, this woman took cuts. You and I hate that when people do that. You know, when we're in the grocery line and we've got a thing of groceries and we're pushing it forward, but it takes a little while because we've got a big thing of groceries, and somebody with just a few items in their arms runs in front of us. What? Now, maybe we're nice, and we say, go ahead and go. But we can't do that for everybody that's got little things in there. Or we're getting out of the parking lot, right? And we're at one of those funny stops where somebody's got to wait for somebody else to go, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and finally it looks like it's your turn, and then some little car zips in front of you, right? And it's like, that's not fair. I've been waiting. You're cutting in front of me. And here he is. The truth is, he's still stuck, right? He's still stuck between the miracle and the mob, literally and figuratively between those. All he wants, one thing in life, all he cares about is his daughter would be healed. She would live. He's stuck in this waiting room that we call life. And I know you've been there. You've been there in your marriage. You've been there in your health. You've been there in your finances. You've been there in trying to figure out your life and where you're going to go. You've been there with friendships you've had. You've been there. There's a miracle you're waiting for you. You keep hoping and praying for it. Doesn't seem to even be taking place at all. And so you're just stuck in the middle of the mob. There's a word in the New Testament for that. It is the word prostekemai. Say it with me. Prostekemai. Prostekemai means waiting with expectation, to wait forward. And we see this all throughout Scripture, right? Where God calls somebody to do something, but they have to wait for the answer to this. We see it way back in Genesis 12. God calls Abraham, follow me and I will make you a great nation. Follow me and I will give you stars, or kids as many as the stars in the sky. He's 75 years old when God comes to him and says that. It's going to be 25 years before that's realized. Just the kids part. Just the first few kids of that. He doesn't have that many grandkids, just a few. Nothing like what God's promised him. He doesn't have land yet that he owns. Nothing happens. And then a few generations later, there's Joseph. God gives him these dreams of greatness that God is going to use him for in his life. And what's it get him? Sold into slavery by his brothers, cast into a prison, forgotten in that prison. And it's another 25 years before God begins to redeem that promise. Here's Moses. Moses has led his people against his will. He led the people out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and into the desert and on the way to the promised land. But then right away, God says, whoa, hold on. You guys lack faith. No, you're going to be wandering for a while. How about 40 years? In fact, Moses, you're not even going to get into the promised land. You're going to go to the edge. I'm going to show it to you. But there's some problems you had. So you're not even going to get into it. We see it over and over and over. David, Samuel, the prophet, comes to him, anoints him as king of Israel. You're the king. He's just a boy. He's just a shepherd. There's already a king. And it's going to be decades before David becomes the king. In fact, it's going to be longer than that before he brings the nation of Israel to a point of restoration. He's going to have to fight for it. He's going to have to endure things for it. Daniel has got all this promise in his life. He's a prince in the kingdom of Jerusalem. He loves the Lord. He loves the church. He wants to give everything to that. And then he's kidnapped and taken to Babylon. And in Babylon, God uses him for greatness. And he's going to wait 80 years. In fact, he's going to wait so long that by the time he can go back, when God does restore Jerusalem, Daniel now believes he's not supposed to go back. You just see this over and over. A few weeks ago, when we were talking about our Christmas stuff, we went to Luke chapter 2. Remember that? There's a couple people there. Jesus comes to the temple, and we're waiting. And there's this guy named Simeon. And Simeon is this old man who's been promised that he would see the Lord's chosen one. And it says that he is waiting for the consolation of Israel. Prosdechomai. He is waiting with expectation. And then after they visit him, there's this another lady, Anna. She's a prophetess. And she gets to see this child as well. And it says when she's done, she shares it with all those who are looking for, waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. Prosdechomai, waiting with expectation. And then in Mark 15, a little bit later, when we get through this book, we're going to see there's this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb is going to become the home for Jesus in his 3 days after his crucifixion. He is a follower of Jesus in these early years. And we're told that he waited for the kingdom of God. He is waiting with anticipation. He is prosdechomai. They were all prosdechomai. They were all waiting for this expectation. They were all waiting forward, and so is this woman. And so is Jairus. Mark says this in verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, still talking to the woman, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? You can't heal her. It's too late. Maybe if the woman hadn't gotten in the way, maybe if the crowds would have separated and let him rush through, come back to Jesus later, maybe there'd be hope, but it's too late. No hope now. But overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid. Just believe. Just keep trusting. Just keep hoping. Just keep having faith. Just keep waiting forward. I live, my house where I'm at now is kind of it's almost at the bottom of a hill. And on the hill just above my house are all these Douglas firs. And they're cool, they're beautiful. But in a storm, they're a little scary because they're waving all these different places. And I'm like, oh, is one of those going to crash on my house or my garage or, whatever's out there? Is it going to do that? But if you know anything about Douglas firs are solid wood. They are good. Their trunks are solid. They're great. And more importantly, their roots go deep, straight down. So as tall as they are, their roots are almost as deep. And they can weather storms. I mean, the trees up there, 40, 50, 60, sometimes older than that. They've weathered lots and lots of storms, probably bigger storms than I'll have in my life. But when we first moved to the property, there was another tree. It was right in the middle of all these trees. And the thing that stood out from this one tree amongst all these other beautiful trees was this one was entirely brown. Everything, the trunk, the branches, there were no leaves, totally brown. And so I knew it was dead. I didn't think about it, but I just knew it was dead. Until a couple years ago, when I went out one morning and realized this tree had broken off at its base and come forward right to the place where, at this moment, our son Jake's trailer is. Would have been right on top of that trailer. Right to the same spot that our other granddaughter, Jasmine, had a trailer just weeks before. But at this point, the only thing in that pathway was my utility trailer. Here's this tree fallen right over the top of my utility trailer, broken the back gate, smashed up the front gate. And I thought to myself, what happened? And then I realized that strength of the trunk, those beautiful roots that go down, they had died. There were no vibrant connections anymore. And I was thinking about this story this week here, as I was doing this. Jesus, what he's telling Jairus, he's saying, you believed when you came to me. You believed when you saw the woman was healed. I want you to keep your faith alive. Just because something has changed in the circumstances around you does not mean that your faith is invalid or that there's no power there. Don't look at the storm. Don't watch the wind. Don't think about the branches. Focus your eyes on the root. Focus your eyes on me. Why? Because faith releases the power of God in your life. Not faith in general, not faith in nothing. That's not this concept of faith, but faith in him who created the world, who sustains the world, who restores the world, who redeems the world. That kind of faith will get you through anything because God is the object of that faith. When you combine faith and conviction, God causes amazing things to happen. You got some serious pain, and all of a sudden, because of your faith in Christ, you have this unbelievable peace about yourself. You have this horrible crisis you're walking through, but because of Christ, you have this confidence that doesn't even make sense. If you believe God is who he says he is, you can experience terrible turmoil in your life, and still on the other side of that, you have tremendous trust. Because it's the faith in what God can and will do. That's what it means when we wait forward, and that's what Jairus needed. Verse 38, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Now, in that culture, when somebody died, you would pay these professional mourners to come in. And they would wail, and they would cry, and they would scream. And Jesus shows up, and all this is going on. That's how you could tell from the community that the person had died inside, because the mourners were there. It says, he went in, and he said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. I mean, Jesus comes. Seriously, are you confused? Do you really think she's just sleeping? No, but see, Jesus has a different perspective on death. For Jesus, death is not the end. It's already shown he's got power over nature. He's already shown he's got power over sickness. He's already shown he's got power over deformity. He's already demonstrated that he has power even over all the spiritual forces of the world. And now he's about to show that he has power over death. Verse 40. But they laughed at him. What a foolish guy, just laughing. And I love this one. After he put them out, who's laughing now, right? Get out of here, get out, just leave. After he put them out, he took the child's father and mother. Jairus, the synagogue leader, no longer a synagogue leader. Now he's just a father. That's all that matters. And the disciples who were with him, Peter, James, and John, his inner circle, and they went to where the child was. Now watch. This is the most beautiful part of the story. He took her by the hand, the child, and he said to her, Talitha cum, which we're told means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Look at this. Talitha. It's a pet name. It's like what you might call your little daughters, your little sons. Princess, young lady, sweet daughter, little sister, precious child. And then this word, cum. It doesn't mean arise by the power of God. No, it just means, hey, it's time to get up. Come on, princess. Time to wake. It's morning, and there's a whole day ahead. You know, as I was reading this part here and thinking about the woman, this series of events here, it's really a tale of two daughters, isn't it? One who's waiting to be rescued from life and all that life has done to her body, and one who's waiting to be rescued from death and all that death intends to do. But they both need the power of Jesus in their lives, and he gives it again. Verse 42. Immediately, see, there's that word again. Immediately, the power, the dynamis, the dynamite. Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. And here's where we're told she's 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished. Isn't that amazing? Everywhere we go, every day when we read stories of Jesus, the people around him are amazed. They're astonished. They're perplexed. They're in wonder. They can't believe what's happening. I have a hard time in my life thinking about why Jesus is such a commonplace thing for us. How we've just taken him so for granted. Because in the days when he roamed this world, preaching and teaching and healing and doing miracles, the world was enamored by him. Everybody was flocking to him. Crowds pressing in against him. Like nothing we have anywhere in our world today. I mean, they didn't just go to a concert and follow him and get close. They followed him around from town to town. They gave up their meals for him, trusting that maybe there'd be something for them at the end. And even if not, it was still worth it. Because the power that Jesus showed, the authority that he showed over every area of his life was absolutely amazing. You know what's great about these two stories? Both of these miracles happen in the touch. The touch of Jesus. The woman, she touched Jesus' robe. And the little girl, Jesus held her hand. How simple, how beautiful is this thought that God wants us to wait for his touch. Whatever we're walking through, whatever we're struggling with, whatever we're dealing with, that God wants to reach us, and he wants to do that through a touch. Whether your health is crashing, whether your marriage is crumbling, whether your heart is cracking, it doesn't really matter because God wants to touch you. He wants you to wait forward, wait persistently, faithfully, trusting, believing, hoping that he will answer you, and he will answer you with his touch. The promise of God's touch. And then whether that healing comes in this world, which we long for, or in the next, which we're certain of, we are never alone, we never have to be afraid, and we need never be ashamed. There's a pastor who passed away a few years ago. He was a long-time radio name, Bible teacher, wrote many books, just a scholar. And I love his words. Warren Wiersbe, some of you may have heard of Warren Wiersbe. He wrote this, speaking about these series of events here. He said, this story doesn't mean that God must always rescue his people from danger or heal every affliction. It means that he holds ultimate authority, that he has the power, that he has the dynamis, that he has the love and the concern and the care. He always knows what's going on. He always plans great things for our life. He will always answer our prayers, always in the affirmative if it's in our best interest. But in the midst of it, we don't always know what that's going to mean. But because we know he has the power, therefore, we can't fear. We can't be afraid of what the world throws at us because God is more powerful. God has more dynamis than anything this world has going for it. So in the midst of our worst trials, in the midst of horrendous pain, in the midst of all these problems we struggle with, Jesus says, hold on, trust, believe. Wait forward for the answer to the promise that I want to give you through my touch. Father, we are grateful to you this morning that you continue to work in our lives, that we never have to wonder or worry that you will hear us. Your word promises that we never have to wonder whether you'll care for us or our needs, that it matters to you because your word promises that we never have to feel alone because your word says that you're always with us, that you never forsake us, that you'll walk with us even through valleys where the death seems inevitable, that you are always there, Lord, and that you will always answer us, and you will always touch us in your time with your promise. And we give you praise for that. We thank you. Help us to see you in everything we do and what we say and in the lives we touch around us. Help us to be faithful in sharing the good news of Jesus, that gospel which reminds us, Lord, that you have created us for great purpose, and that is to be with you and walk with you forever.